And my guest today is Arto Vaun, who is a poet and a musician from Boston. Arto is also a senior lecturer at the American University of Armenia. He's recently established a creative writing center in Yerevan and also a literary journal called Locomotive. He's also the author of Capillarity, a book of poems published in 2009. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mr. Vaun.
My pleasure.
My first question, why did you feel the need to establish a creative writing center in Armenia?
There were a number of reasons. I think that we're in the 21st century now, 101 years after the genocide. We're at a point where we have to start thinking more seriously about cultural production. Armenia has a very rich heritage of literature, as we know. However, over the last few decades, and particularly since independence, there has been a real drop-off in terms of world-class literary production, which is able to kind of bridge Armenia connected to the rest of the world. And so I thought that this is, first of all, it's something that doesn't really exist in the whole region. There is no such center, nor is there this kind of Anglophone literary journal that's coming out from this part of the world and being exported outside. So I really feel that the center and the journal are going to be kind of umbrellas where we can bring together local writers, poets, novelists, and connect them to the outside literary community on a global level so that we can really elevate our cultural discourse, which I think is really paramount right now. It's really important, I think, that this many years after the genocide, we start having a much more sophisticated and more robust discourse about where we stand.
And as far as the importance of Armenian writers, local or diaspora, being able to create in a second language or in another language other than Armenian, you've spoken about this before in your lectures. What importance does that have? Because recently we saw that Peter Balakian won a prize, and that brought a lot of attention to the issues he was discussing, simply because he was able to write, his literature is in English.
Absolutely, yeah, and I mean that's a fantastic honor that's been given to Peter. It's well deserved, and yeah, I think that again one of the missions for the center is to be able to empower local writers to not just elevate their writing in Armenian, but really also to be able to get involved in self-translation, to connect to world-class translators, so we can get Armenian literature out into the rest of the world. It's the reality that Armenian, being a non-Romance language, our alphabet and so forth, it makes it difficult for people who are not Armenian, who don't know Armenian, to connect to all the wonderfully talented writers that we have here. And I think that, of course, then that causes the writers here who already feel isolated, who already feel like they're not paid enough attention to, they're not read enough. So it's really, this is a small country, and there are already very few people doing a very high level of artistic output. So it's very important to start connecting them to the wider artistic and literary community.
You also have done research in diaspora literatures, and I wanted to ask you specifically post-genocide, first generation Armenian literature output and the difference as to what has changed ever since. In subject matter, in language, in every other way.
I think that what we can see in the writers right around the time of the genocide is to me, it's so profoundly sad. Because really what we see there is these are writers who were creating at a time of the modernist movement in Europe, a lot of whom knew some modernist literature, who had studied in Europe or so forth. So these very important ideas that were spreading around the world were just getting to these Armenian writers. So we really see a kind of a stunted kind of growth in Armenian literature. It's not that there weren't some excellent Armenian writers during and after the genocide. Of course there were. But overall, what we find is a lot of ideas, themes, poetic forms that are still kind of stuck in a 19th century, more romanticized ideas about nationalism and themes that really the modernists were trying to disrupt. The narrative in the modernist period was about disrupting language and reflecting the more fragmentary nature of reality.
So can we say in a way that Armenian literature skipped a whole movement, stayed behind a whole movement and is trying to follow up now? Yeah,
I mean, I guess we can, because it's like anything else, right? I mean, when you have a genocide, you have a systematic cutting off at the roots of a culture that's been in perpetual motion up until that period. So then you have a moment where hundreds and hundreds of years of forward momentum is suddenly cut off. So of course that would mean that across the board, including in literature, you have a whole generation of writers who knows what they were going to write, let's say in 1930, 1925, and so forth. Instead, what you have is the surviving writers, like Oshagan, let's say, for example, Hagop Oshagan, who are then just constantly in a battle of how to not write about the genocide, because they're stuck with that ghost that we are still grappling with today in some respect. You said how to not write about the genocide, and I see this problem still persists in today's writers like yourself, like Balakian, like many others. And in your poetry book, you do write about the genocide, but not directly, not descriptively. However, your experience is quite different. Is that of a second generation, third generation survivor whose experience is that of a relationship with the survivors. Mm-hmm. I mean, could you elaborate more as to, could you skip the subject of genocide as a creative person? Did you have that option psychologically? Did you feel that you did? I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know what the answer to that is. I can say that in my own case, I feel that, you know, I really think that specifically now we're talking about, let's say, artistic output and public intellectuals and so forth. I think we need to start moving away from this victimhood, this idea of trauma and all these things. These are important elements. However, I think that really what we are the victims of now is not the genocide. Now we're the victims of the neuroses and the confused emotions that are the aftermaths of the genocide. In other words, you know, I am not the victim of the genocide. My mother wasn't the victim of the genocide. My grandmother was barely the victim of the genocide. That we need to grapple with those ideas and begin to disrupt the narrative. We've gotten stuck a little bit, I think, in this one kind of narrative that paints us all as some kind of victims or survivors, and that is somehow driving our sense of identity. And it's simply not, to me. You know, I am equally proud, conflicted. You know, I have complicated feelings about being an American as I do with being an Armenian, and those two things to me are equal because I'm most concerned about being a human being. So I think in going back to literature, I think that for me at least, there's no question that if you're raised with this kind of melancholic and neurotic element of the effects of the genocide and denial of the genocide, and the constant focus in the diaspora, maybe more in the diaspora than in Armenia, to some extent, you know, I don't know, but regardless, if you're brought up in a household wherever you are, and the focus is so much on this one specific historical event and the denial of that event, you know, you're the victim of something a little bit different at that point than survival. You know, the survivors of the genocide are our great-grandparents. Those are actual survivors. Our job is to have to honor them, is to have a much more critical and open and complicated discussion about what are we doing overall, in the sense that in my work, there was no way that I could simply write another book that's about a grandmother or a grandfather and about, you know, that addresses these things in such a way that actually in some ways trivializes their weight and the actual horror and the seriousness of it. I didn't want it to relegate it to just another romanticized kind of thematically not so interesting and technically not so interesting work. So for me, in my book, the idea was to challenge myself to constantly disrupt this narrative that I think is a unhealthy narrative to some extent.
And in form as well, you've tried to do that in narrative as well as form, from what I understand, because looking at your book, looking for titles, and realizing that there are none.
Yeah, I mean, the book ended up being a kind of, it's one long poem. It's not a book of poems, where it's long, it's one poem broken into parts. There's no linear sense of time or chronological order or even a straight narrative. Because to me, that's an impossibility. I can't just tell the story, any kind of story about this kind of a catastrophe in some kind of straight narrative. That in a way takes away the complicated it takes away the layers of nuance that are in that story, and it relegates it to some kind of old-fashioned type of storytelling, which I think is doesn't do the genocide or something like the genocide justice.
But yet you managed to cover life in Syria, life as a repatriate to Armenia, and life and yet second diaspora in America. I was going to ask you to read a segment if you could, please.
Okay, sure, I'd be happy to. So as I said, the book is one long poem in different sections. It's a I'd be lying if I didn't say that it's somewhat autobiographical, but it's fictionalized. There's no direct addressing of Armenia per se or the genocide per se. In this section, I'll just read. This is the speaker addressing his mother, and you'll notice that there are themes of language, there are themes of trauma, but there's a constant kind of grappling with that in a different way. Mother, it's so late in the North Sea air. Your son's body is lit by faint city light, slouched against the past, soft-lipped. Look how his leg twitches, wants to get going, reach the word family again, as though such a thing ever was. Migration doesn't allow you to fathom these words, and that's been our ocean spread silver between us. For years we've been fighting language, tidal wave after tidal wave, punching sounds from our mouths, leaving no room for a deep breath. That is what being rootless is. Wading up to our necks, dazed after a flood no one saw coming. Our feet barely touch the earth under the thick water. All the way from here I can see you, someone's mother, soaked, thin as a glass stem, pummeled by history and unbelonging. I want to say you shouldn't be afraid. Though the water is endless and loud, though it scatters us, you shouldn't be afraid. I can see you from here.
Thank you very much, and I hope this is the discussion we continue having for generations on about how to face the trauma that is directly or indirectly ours.